I guess my first question is to you, Mr. Harbeck. I've only been around here for less than 2 years. But my take on what happens is basically the industry gets a license to do a lot of things and then fails at it, and we're left to pick up the pieces. If you look at why SIPC was created, it was created because there were these huge bankruptcies that occurred in the early 70s, and money was taken from investors, and we wanted to make investors whole. So then SIPC is created, and as you pointed out, for a long period of time, because you thought you had ample funds, these brokers were only paying $150 a year. For 19 years, they were paying $150 a year. Now, you've increased it recently because of the Madoff scandal. But I have one question, which is, I think the insurance product is out of date. And I think that it's very important for you to go back and reformulate an insurance product that reflects the way people invest today. And people invest today through mutual funds and hedge funds. And if you're going to offer a product that has no relevance today but had relevance in 1970, I don't believe you're doing your job. Now, secondly, I have a question for you, which is, if now you're charging 0.25% of the revenue, the net revenue that's generated by a broker, to refill the fund, what would prevent you from coming up with a 1/8 of 1% of revenue to create a fund to pay the Madoff victims some kind of compensation? There's nothing that precludes you from doing that, is it? Is there?
It would have to be statutory, Congresswoman.
It would have to be. Well,
yes.
You were able to make this change from $150 to a 1/4 of 1% with no trouble, right?
Yes, by bylaw.
You did that by law?
By bylaw.
By bylaw. Well, couldn't you create a new bylaw?
Well, we can only expend our money in one particular way, to supplement the fund of customer property in the way that the statute describes. Our bylaw says that when our fund is in danger of reaching $1 billion or less, that we can reinstitute for that purpose. But what you're saying is that we would have to repurpose the statute and to create a fund specifically for these victims.
And you're saying that that would require statutory, not something you could do. You're a separate corporation. I'm having a hard time understanding why you as a corporation can't just decide that because of this travesty and because the insurance product that you offer is inadequate today, and it should have been reformulated anyway, that you cannot create a new fee that would be imposed. It would be a modest fee, but it could help immeasurably a lot of people.
We are in fact a creature of statute. We are not a government organization, but the statute creating us was a federal statute.
Well, you know, that's the problem. We're real great at passing laws, creating these entities outside of government to operate. FINRA is another one that I can't quite understand. And yet you have to come back to government to fix things. Either you should be a federal agency where we have responsibility, the ability to act immediately, or you should be an independent corporation and then would have the ability to do things that you do independent of statute. But having said that, I have a question for Mr. Connolly, and we're about to go for a vote. Mr. Connolly, from my perspective, and this may predate your involvement at the SEC, but having observed over the course now of these 2 years the Madoff fiasco, the travesty that it has created, just not for the American people, but for the federal government. The SEC failed. It failed miserably. When we had the whistleblower before us, I was astonished at the degree by which he continued to pursue this. I mean, he came before the SEC 5 or 6 times seeking the SEC to take some action against Mr. Madoff. And even when the SEC went out to see Mr. Madoff has now admitted that when the question was asked of him, who is your custodian? And he rattled off a name, And he was convinced that within the next 3 days he'd be shut down because the custodian did not provide those services to Mr. Madoff. But then the SEC never even made the phone call to find out whether or not Mr. Madoff was operating through that custodian. So from my perspective, the government, the federal government, failed miserably, and the SEC in particular. So my question to you is this. Since we were responsible for this travesty, shouldn't we take some responsibility now in trying to make the people that were impacted by our incompetence and by our malfeasance by creating a fund to make them somewhat whole? And what would prevent the SEC from doing that?
Well, Congresswoman, thank you. I can respond in two ways. The fund that you talk about is certainly something that Congress could do. If it determined that that was the appropriate thing to do here, certainly you could do that. With respect to the shortfall, the failures that you've identified, that is something which the Commission has recognized and takes extremely seriously. And since Chairman Shapiro has come to the Commission, in fact, there have been numerous reforms that have been put in place that are directly responsive to what you identified, which is the Inspector General's report, which identified very serious failings at the Commission. And among the things that have changed, that on a going forward basis, make sure that something like this will not happen again, is that there has been the training of hundreds of employees to be certified fraud examiners. There is the requirement now, addressing something you raised here, in all examinations of third-party verification of customer assets that are held at by the investment advisor or broker-dealer. And we're also been hiring more people with particularized expertise that will make the examination teams much more effective. And we're working to deploy more people to the front lines, more investigators who will be there and be able to root out this fraud in an effective way. So all that has happened, and there are greater reforms that are even coming down the road. Next week, for example, the Commission will be voting on rules designed particularly to address the situation of investment advisors and the custody situation, that would encourage investment advisors not to have custody of customer assets, and instead to have them with third parties to prevent the exact kind of stuff that went wrong here.
My time has expired, Mr. Chairman, but I certainly think that we need to appreciate that going forward doesn't fix those who've been injured by government's inaction, and that we should really reflect on what we can do to make whole some of these people.